Launching this dashboard, I'd like to frame it in terms of launching the process of dashboarding, that is keeping track of relevant data on our gateway cities, but always updating, doing different versions to create different arguments. What these dashboards can do in providing this sort of data can help in, didn't do that very well, it can help with de-mythologizing. And that's something that those of us in these gateway cities are very concerned about, is how are our cities perceived in the state capital and the national capital. So the notion is to tell that news story, the story as we see it, the story based on what's actually happening here, rather than perceptions 20 years ago or 30 years ago. We need something that's public. We need something that's easy to understand. The data we provide has to have the right time scale on it, cover the right geographic area, has to enable comparisons between different cities in Australia, like between the gateway cities and the capital cities. The information has to be meaningful, it has to be convincing. It has to be affordable, timely, and updatable. And it benefits from having input from government, business, and community. So in some ways, this notion of making evidence public relates to that notion in the legal fraternity of estoppel. And what the Gateway Cities Alliance report that came out about, I don't know, 10 months ago is an example. You make a glossy report, lots of information, launch it publicly. You then cannot deny that that information is there. And that's what the definition of estoppel says. If you go to Google Dictionary, it precludes a person from asserting something as contrary to what's been accepted by a previous statement or action. So if we make the conditions and the performance of our cities more public, it prevents people from, in the state government or federal government or outside investors, from adhering to an old version or an old view of our cities. So here's an example from that dashboard of jobs in manufacturing across the 3 cities. We know that the proportion of jobs in manufacturing has been declining for several decades in these 3 cities. It's something 3 cities shares, that history of manufacturing. And so what the dashboard does is it shows these downward sloping curves and it makes the message simple. We can also look at population and how it's been growing over a period of time in Newcastle, Geelong, and Wollongong. And the notion is to, on that horizontal axis, to use the right time scale, whether it's 10 years or 50 years, show this is a long-term trend. It's not a little bit of noise in the data set. And you say, okay, well, those are our gateway cities. What about the real growth story in Gold Coast? How does that compare to our gateway cities? And if you look at that population chart on the dashboard, you can see the Gold Coast has, the population growth there has been quite dramatic. And so what the dashboard does is it enables that sort of comparison, but it also alerts us to the notion of, are we looking at the right spatial scale? The Gold Coast, maybe 10 years ago, 20 years ago, the ABS started counting Tweed Heads as well, a portion of New South Wales. So you would have seen an upward tick in population simply because a greater area was being encompassed. So with any of this data, the notion is, are we measuring on the right spatial scale, right, same comparative scale over time? If we look at employment in healthcare and social assistance, that's the highest, the sector with the greatest proportion of employment across the 10 largest cities in Australia. So what that shows across our cities is that Newcastle has the highest share of employment in healthcare and social assistance, and it's a higher proportion than in one of the capital cities, and in Sydney or in Melbourne. So it's meaningful. That shows in this comparison, you get something out that has implications. In Newcastle, some people refer to it as a city of makers due to both the manufacturing, but also the strength of the arts sector. Let's see what the dashboard tells us about that. So if you look at the proportion of the workforce employed in arts and recreation services, you'll see, interestingly, Newcastle ranks just below Wollongong and Geelong. And so those people in Newcastle may not be aware of the growth of the Arts and Recreation Centre in Geelong. If we bring in the capital cities, you'll see that Sydney and Melbourne rank in terms of proportion of employment on arts and recreation services above the gateway cities. If we bring in Hobart, you can see that ranks above Melbourne and Sydney. And people recognize, they know the notion of Mona and Salamanca markets being examples of what we see as the arts and recreation services within Hobart. But what if we look at our friend, the Gold Coast? You can see that ranks even higher than Hobart, with 3% of the workforce in arts and recreation services. So is that convincing to call Newcastle having a strong arts sector? Are we measuring the right thing here? Is this proportion of the workforce in a particular area really the way to capture it? Particularly when you consider that in the Gold Coast, Sophie Monk would be considered as employed in arts and recreation services. Is that really the sector of the creative industries and recreation services that we'd like to look at? We can also look at more timely data. This isn't on the Gateway Cities dashboard. It's on another dashboard just applying to Newcastle, but looking at the impact of COVID-19. And this shows the number of new cases of COVID-19 infections and the road traffic. And here we can see how as the number of cases increased and there were the economic shutdowns, the magnitude of the road traffic decreased to where, and then it bounced back. So as of mid-July, we were back to 80% of normal weekday traffic during a peak time period on a Wednesday afternoon. On weekends, the volume of road traffic has returned to the normal level. Tells you about the extent of the economic shutdown as well as the extent of social distancing. So here you can use a dashboard. It's illustrated how you can use a dashboard to provide data that's timely, but also affordable. The data on the COVID-19 infections came from New South Wales Health, and the data on traffic levels came from Transport for New South Wales, who set us spreadsheets every month or two on how the traffic was going. Then the question becomes, what else would you like to see? That notion of these dashboards benefiting from input in people in government, community, and business. So here's rent by local government area. And there on the right side, you can see the city of Newcastle. And as you go down, you can see Maitland, a very fast growing suburb, about half hour's drive outside Newcastle. Another half an hour to an hour further out is Singleton, where the mining community is strong. And another hour down the road is Musselbrook, another mining town. Those are rent on a 3-bedroom house. And you can say, what would happen? I got a little bit of a problem here. Here we go. What would happen if we added coal prices to that? And here you can see below thermal coal prices and how they peaked in December, January 2007, 2008, sometime during the year of 2008. And then 4 years later, the rents peaked in Maitland. Well, not in Maitland a bit, in Singleton and Musselbrook. There was overbuilding, then the rents declined, and then they picked up back again on the historical trend. So here with input from government, business, and community, you can get a sense of what is it we really need to be looking at and over what time scale? What other factors could go into this dashboard? And in that way, because the dashboard is a reason for the sectors to come together, it can be referred to as what's called a boundary object. And in assembling these dashboards, we want to make sure that we use international leading practices. And here's an example from Dublin, who's developed their dashboard development was led by Rob Tyson at a university, Maintooth University there. And he's a great critic of dashboards, but a great creator as well. You can see here on their chart for house completions, how they've got some of that COVID-19 impact picked up, with the number of house completions declining dramatically, but also an illustration of the long-term trends. So here's what the home page of the Gateway Cities Alliance dashboard looks like. Consider it dashboard 1.0, something that really needs input from people like yourselves, saying what should we be tracking over what time frame and comparing what cities. And you can see there at the top, it has options for what you can compare, what indicators, is it unemployment, is it employment, different industry sectors? Do you want to compare different indicators for a single city? And at the bottom, there's the selection of cities you can look at. Here's the URL, and soon enough, this link will be provided from the Gateway Cities Alliance website itself. So as I alluded to, it's not a dashboard that's cast in concrete. I'm thinking more of the notion of dashboarding. It's not the board you're watching, it's the performance and the conversations about it. And so from this little illustration, you've seen the notion of it makes data public, and that helps that de-mythologizing, saying once this information is public, you can no longer view these cities through a very old lens. It simplifies. It shouldn't just provide data, it should really provide a focus on key questions. The scale has to be right, both the time scale and the geographic scale. It enables comparisons. The data should be meaningful and it needs to be convincing. The accumulation of the data in the presentation has to be done in a way that's affordable. It has to be timely. It has to be relevant to issues we're concerned about. It has to be updatable. And it's a reason for government, business, and community to come together and decide what's the story that we really need to be telling. And as I alluded to before, it then can become a boundary object, a reason for conversations based on evidence across those sectors, government, business, and community, and between people who live in our cities and our regions, and those people outside of its state government, federal government, or the business sector that may be considering investing. And here are some references you can see when you get the PowerPoints later. So what I'm looking for is, a notion of a partnership, because in looking at the future of our cities and our regions, the notion of getting multiple stakeholders across government, business, and community to agree on how to create that future is a daunting task. A first step can be seen to be agreeing on what to measure. So we're really looking for city and regional partners. And if I'm clever, I can put together a proposal for the Australian Research Council where they'll pay 75% of the cost of developing these dashboards, of doing this dashboarding process, but also assessing it. To what extent is this effective? And is this a process that other cities and regions should be engaging in? So again, here's the launch of the Gateway Cities Alliance Dashboard 1.0, or a launch into dashboarding generally.